everyone, welcome to this deep dive. It's going to be all about a text that really dives deep into the fall, from Genesis.
Hmm.
I know what you're thinking, like, haven't we all heard this story a million times?
Yeah,
But
yeah.
trust me on this one. This source, it takes this really fascinating angle, okay?
Mm.
And it uncovers like this thread of hope and grace that you might not expect, honestly.
Yeah. You know what? That's exactly what struck me too when I first read this. It's so easy to get caught up in like the disobedience and all the consequences,
Yeah.
the doom and gloom.
Right.
But this source, it really digs into these promises that are woven right into the narrative of the fall. You know what I mean? It's like they're hiding in plain sight.
Totally. And I think that's where your expertise comes in. I'm so excited to hear you unpack all these layers of meaning, especially for listeners out there who are already familiar with like the basic story.
Absolutely.
So where do we even begin with all of this?
Well, I think a good place to start is Genesis 3.15.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, it's often called the Proto-Evangelium.
Whoa, hold on.
Proto-Evangelium.
Okay, I am going to need you to break that down for me.
Sure, it sounds super intimidating,
Okay.
but it just means first gospel.
Okay.
So right in the middle of all that judgment, remember God's laying down the law and there are consequences for Adam and Eve's actions.
Right.
But even in that moment, we get this glimmer of good news.
Hold on. So even as God is saying, hey, there are rules and you broke them, there's this little promise tucked in there too. That's kind of wild.
It is. And it's not just like a subtle hint either.
Yeah.
It's pretty powerful stuff.
Okay, so what does it actually say? What are the exact words?
All right, so the verse describes this conflict between the serpent and the woman's offspring.
Okay.
And it culminates in this final victory. Okay? It says, he will crush your head and you will strike his heel.
Wow. Okay, that imagery is, well, it's not exactly your typical Sunday school material.
You got that right. It's pretty intense, but it's also deeply symbolic.
Okay. I'm trying to picture this in my head. What's the significance of all that imagery? The crushing and the striking?
It foreshadows Jesus' ultimate triumph over Satan.
Whoa. Okay, so even way back then in Genesis, it's pointing to Jesus.
Exactly, the serpent striking the heel.
Yeah.
That represents the suffering that Jesus endured on the cross.
Yeah.
It was a temporary setback. But crushing the serpent's head, that's the decisive victory over sin and death.
So even as humanity is like taking this huge misstep, messing things up big time,
Right.
God is already setting a plan in motion to redeem the situation.
That's exactly it. It's like this glimmer of light in the darkness.
I love that. And what's really remarkable is that this first gospel, it wasn't like some obscure footnote or something.
Right.
It became like this cornerstone of early Christian theology. It shaped how people understood God's plan for salvation.
Absolutely. It had a huge impact.
Mhm.
And this source, it doesn't stop there. It highlights all these other surprising moments of grace that are sprinkled throughout the story of the fall.
Really? Give me an example. I'm all about finding those unexpected silver linings.
Okay, so think about that moment when God calls out, Adam, where are you? In Genesis 3.9.
Okay. Yeah.
Now, on the surface, it might seem like an angry judge is tracking down a fugitive, right?
Yeah. I can see that God's been defied and there are some serious consequences to face.
But this source, it encourages us to hear a different tone in God's voice.
Okay. What do you mean?
It's not this booming wrath that we might expect, but more like the heartbroken call of a loving father who's searching for his lost children.
Wow, that changes everything. Suddenly, it's not just about justice, it's about a relationship that's been broken.
Exactly.
And God isn't just waiting around to punish Adam and Eve, he's actively seeking reconciliation with them.
Precisely. And this theme of divine pursuit, it continues throughout the entire Bible. Think about the parable of the lost sheep or the prodigal son. God is always the one initiating the reunion, no matter how far we've strayed.
It's like this powerful reminder that God's love is relentless and never gives up. It just keeps on going. Even when we mess up, he's not giving up on us.
Never. And that brings us to another often overlooked detail.
Okay, what's that?
The provision of clothing for Adam and Eve in Genesis 3.21.
Oh yeah, it's easy to just skip over that part. But there's something really profound about God taking the time to clothe them after everything that happened.
I agree. It's not just about covering up their physical nakedness.
Right.
It points to something much deeper. It foreshadows the spiritual clothing that only God can provide.
You're talking about the covering that we receive through Jesus, right? His righteousness becomes our righteousness.
Exactly. Even in this early account of sin and judgment, we see this hint of the grace that will ultimately redeem us. God's already foreshadowing his plan to restore what's been broken.
It's like that saying, God doesn't waste or hurt. Even the consequences of sin, they become part of his redemptive story.
And that, I think, is one of the most important takeaways from this source. It encourages us to look beyond just the surface of the fall. and to see those seeds of hope that God has planted, seeds that will ultimately blossom into full redemption through Jesus.
That is powerful stuff. But I gotta be honest, there's one part of this whole story that still feels like a straight-up punishment to me. Being expelled from Eden, being kicked out of paradise, it doesn't exactly scream grace to me.
I get that reaction.
Hmm.
But this source, it asks us to consider a really thought-provoking question. What if being banished from the garden was actually a form of protection?
Protection.
How so?
Well, think about it for a second. What would happen if Adam and Eve had eaten from the tree of life after the fall?
They would have lived forever, right?
Yes. But in a fallen state,
Oh.
separated from God, carrying the weight of sin and all its consequences forever, that would be a pretty bleak existence, a never-ending cycle of brokenness.
Well, I never thought of it that way. Living forever in that state. It sounds more like a curse than a blessing.
Right. And by barring them from the tree of life, God was actually preventing a much worse fate. It was a painful separation, yes, but it preserved the possibility of ultimate restoration.
So expulsion, it was a merciful act. It was part of a bigger plan.
That's the beauty of this source. It challenges us to rethink our assumptions and to see even the difficult parts of the story through this lens of God's love and his plan for redemption. Okay, I'm starting to get it. Even the parts of the story that feel like pure judgment, they actually have these layers of grace woven into them.
Right. It's like God is always working behind the scenes, orchestrating everything.
Even when it doesn't seem obvious at all.
Exactly. It's about recognizing those little hints of those unexpected turns that point to something bigger.
So if expulsion was part of this bigger plan, how does it connect to the hope that we find in Jesus? I mean, we've jumped from Genesis 3 all the way to this idea of redemption.
Right.
Help me bridge that gap.
Sure. It's all about the movement from brokenness to wholeness, expulsion. It was necessary.
Yeah.
But it wasn't the end goal.
Okay.
It was a step toward the ultimate solution.
And that solution is found in Jesus.
Exactly.
Okay. But how does Jesus fit into all this? We're talking about events that happened centuries before he was even born.
That's the amazing thing about God's plan. It unfolds over time, but it's always cohesive. It all points to the same goal.
Right.
Remember that image from Genesis 3.15? The serpent striking the heel, but ultimately having its head crushed?
Yeah. The image that foreshadows Jesus' victory over Satan.
That's where the connection becomes clear. Jesus is the one who fulfills that ancient prophecy.
So the fall, it sets the stage for this epic showdown. And Jesus is the hero who steps in to save the day.
That's a great way to put it. And this source, it really emphasizes that Jesus' victory isn't just some abstract theological concept.
Okay.
It has real-world implications for us.
Okay, I'm listening. What are those implications? How does Jesus' victory actually play out in our lives?
Well, think about it this way. The fall introduced sin into the world. And sin, it creates separation from God. It's like a wall that divides us.
And that wall, that's what causes all the brokenness, the pain, the guilt, everything that we experience because we live in a fallen world.
Exactly. But Jesus Alaparty, he breaks down that wall.
Okay.
Through his sacrifice. He removes the barrier that separates us from God. He bridges the gap.
So it's not just about escaping punishment, it's about restoring that relationship with God.
That's the heart of it. And this source, it goes even deeper than that. It highlights this concept of righteousness.
Okay.
Because of Jesus, we can be made right with God.
It's like a clean slate, a fresh start.
Exactly. It's not about trying to earn our way back to God by being good.
Right.
It's about accepting the gift of righteousness that he offers us through Jesus.
And that's where the true hope comes from. It's not about striving for perfection, which is impossible anyway.
Right.
It's about resting in what Christ has already done for us.
That's a game changer. It takes all the pressure off.
Totally.
Yeah.
Knowing that we don't have to clean ourselves up before we can even approach God.
Yeah.
He's already done all the work.
Exactly. And that changes everything about how we live our lives, how we deal with struggles, how we relate to others.
Okay, so we've talked about these big theological ideas, grace, redemption, righteousness. But how does this source connect these concepts to our everyday lives? What does it look like to actually live out this hope in practical ways?
That's where things get really interesting. This source, it doesn't just leave you with all these abstract ideas. It gives you some really concrete ways to apply these truths to your daily life.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, one of the things it emphasizes is the importance of remembering.
Remembering what?
Remembering Jesus' victory over the serpent when you're tempted to give in to sin.
Okay.
It's like having that image in your mind, the serpent's head being crushed, a reminder that sin doesn't win in the end.
That makes sense. So I've got remembering, What else does the source suggest?
It also talks about trust,
Trusting what?
trusting in God's plan, even when you don't understand what's happening.
That's tough, though, right?
Mm,
Especially when life throws those curveballs our way. It's hard to let go of control.
absolutely.
Yeah.
But God's ways are not our ways.
Right.
He sees the bigger picture. Even when things look bleak, he's working to bring about his purposes.
It's like surrendering to the mystery.
Yes, trusting that God has it all under control.
And that kind of trust, it leads to peace, even in the middle of all the chaos.
That's why this message of hope is so important. It's an anchor for us when we feel like we're drowning.
So we've got remembering, trusting. What's a third practical takeaway?
The source, it encourages us to find solace in the cross.
What does that mean exactly?
It means taking time to really meditate on God's love, to really grasp what Jesus did for us when he died on the cross.
It's like going back to the source of our redemption.
Yes, reminding ourselves that we are loved, forgiven, accepted,
No matter what.
no matter what. And that's powerful stuff.
It's like a spiritual reset button,
Yeah.
you know?
Right. We're not defined by our failures. We're defined by God's grace. And that, I think, is the ultimate message of hope that this source wants to convey. It's not just a story about the past. It's a living truth that can transform our lives right now and give us hope for the future.
It's incredible how this source has taken a story we think we know so well, the fall,
Yeah.
and it reveals all these like hidden depths of meaning.
Mhm.
I feel like I'm seeing the whole thing with totally new eyes.
That's what happens when we approach those ancient texts with a fresh perspective.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes we get so stuck in what we think we already know
Right.
that we miss out on the nuances, the subtle but powerful threads of grace and hope that are woven throughout.
And speaking of grace, I want to circle back to something you mentioned earlier, God's provision of clothing for Adam and Eve.
Oh, yeah.
It's one of those details that's easy to just kind of gloss over, but you were saying it has a much deeper significance.
It does. On the surface, it's an act of compassion. God doesn't leave them standing there exposed and ashamed.
Right.
He provides for their needs, even after they disobeyed him.
It's like that image of a parent comforting a child who's made a mistake. There's discipline, for sure,
Right.
but there's also tenderness and care.
Exactly. And the source, it takes that idea even further.
Yeah.
It suggests that this act of clothing, it's like foreshadowing the ultimate covering that we receive through Jesus.
You mean the idea of being clothed in Christ's righteousness?
Yes.
Yes.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Just as God provided those physical garments to cover Adam and Eve's nakedness,
Mm-hmm.
he provides a spiritual covering through Jesus to cover our sin.
So it's not just about hiding our shame, it's about being made clean, having our imperfections clothed in the perfect righteousness of Christ.
Exactly. And this source, it really stresses that this covering, it's not something we can earn.
Right.
It's a gift freely given to us through faith in Jesus.
It's a powerful reminder, especially in a world that's constantly telling us that we need to do more, be better, prove ourselves.
It's like the opposite of that performance-based mentality. The source encourages us to just receive God's grace.
Yeah. Yeah.
To rest in that knowledge that we are fully accepted and loved, not because of anything we've done, but because of who Jesus is.
So we've talked about God seeking Adam and Eve, providing clothing for them, and ultimately offering redemption through Jesus.
Right.
But there's still this one piece of the puzzle that I keep coming back to, the expulsion from Eden. How does this source reconcile that seemingly harsh punishment with all this talk about hope and grace?
That's a great question. And this source, it actually tackles that head on. It asks us to think about the possibility that expulsion, while undeniably painful, was actually an act of mercy.
Mercy, being kicked out of paradise, that sounds like the opposite of mercy.
I know. It seems counterintuitive. But think about it. What would have happened if Adam and Eve had stayed in the garden after the fall?
They would have lived forever, but in a state of separation from God.
Right, exactly. Burdened by sin and its consequences. And that separation, it would have been eternal because they had access to the tree of life.
Oh, wow. So God was actually protecting them from something much worse.
Exactly. It was a tough love kind of move, a necessary intervention.
It's like when a parent takes a dangerous object away from a child. The child might not understand why.
Exactly. But the parent knows better.
It highlights the fact that God sees the bigger picture.
Yes. And his actions, even the ones that seem harsh to us, are motivated by love and a desire for our ultimate good.
So expulsion, it was a redirection, a course correction to get humanity back on track.
That's a great way to put it. And ultimately, that redirection leads to Jesus, who is the only one who can truly heal what's been broken.
So the fall, with all its pain and consequences, it becomes part of this larger redemptive narrative.
And that's the message of hope that this source leaves us with. It's not just a story about something that happened way back when. It's a living truth that can transform us and offer us hope for the future.
This deep dive, it's been so insightful. I feel like I have a much deeper understanding now of the fall and how it relates to my own life.
That's great to hear.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most important takeaways here is that God's love never fails, even when we mess up, even when we feel totally distant from Him.
Right.
His plan for redemption, it's still moving forward.
It's like that line from Romans where sin increased, grace increased all the more.
Exactly. And that grace, it's available to all of us,
No matter what.
no matter what. This source, it encourages us to embrace that grace and to rest in the truth that we are loved and accepted in Christ.
That is a powerful message to end on. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us today.
It's been my pleasure.
And to everyone listening, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a fresh perspective on the story of the fall and the incredible message of hope it contains. Until next time, keep seeking, keep growing, and keep the faith.